Welcome back to Pencils and Lipstick. This is Kat Caldwell, and you are listening to episode 241. Today, I have an interview with Monica Hay, as promised. She is a Hey everyone, welcome back to Pencils and Lipstick. This is episode 241, and I am Kat Caldwell. Today I have an interview with Monica Hay. She is a book coach who specializes in helping writers overcome procrastination and perfectionism, and she especially likes helping people who have ADHD or other neuro differences. Because she specializes in procrastination, which you're going to hear a lot about in this interview. I think it's really important to know and understand that we're all very different, and that while I have a lot of tips for you as a writer to get your writing done, what you really have to do is find your way around the whole writing process, whether you're writing short stories or novels or essays or whatever it is. So the links for Monica Hay, what she's talking about, the boot camp and all that, will be in the show notes below. It is also an affiliate link, so I will get paid a little bit if you click it, but to no extra cost to you. I also have the Escape the Plot Forest link in the show notes below as well. I think you guys should check out both of them. You don't have to attend them if they're not for you, but you can they kind of overlap, honestly. So I don't know how much time you have, but the boot camp for Monica Hay is October 18th through the 21st, and that's over a weekend. So I hope that you'll be able to make time for that. And then the Plot Forest starts on October 19th. So just check them out, see if they're for you, listen to this episode and see if you would like to work with Monica. She's quite funny, and I like her personality to sort of, she understands how to wrangle us writers and get us to sit down and get our work done, which is awesome, right? That is actually really life-changing when you can see the novel like grow before your eyes. It's almost like magic, but really it's just getting a good coach sometimes. As far as this month goes, right now I am pre-recording this intro because I am on my way, as this episode goes out, to North Carolina. God bless North Carolina. Everyone keep praying for North Carolina. But I will not be in the hurricane area. I will be a couple hundred miles to the east of them, and I will be at a marketing conference. So I will give you guys an update on what I thought about that conference when I get back. Next week, I will be showing you guys an interview with Rhonda Douglas, and we talk about rejection, which is like part of our lives as writers, and it's really hard to go through in the beginning and still at the end. And so we're going to just talk frankly about the writing life and rejection and what that means. So right now, I hope that you guys enjoy this interview with Monica Hay. Again, all the links that you need to know are in the show notes below. You can click on any of them, and you are under no obligation to attend anything if you don't want to. But Monica has a pretty good deal for the boot camp where you can sort of be introduced to her and her method and see if it's right for you, which I think is amazing. You don't have to, pay for this one-on-one coaching thing to get to know her and see what she's like. And then Escape the Plot Forest is free if you have the time to listen to everyone kind of within the first 24 hours. And don't forget that my talk is on the 22nd. So if you get on my writer's newsletter, you will be told about that talk. And if you are thinking that you want to read Bended Love, and you want to be an ARC reader as a listener to the show, you can click on that link. It is still there below. Bended Love comes out next Monday, so we'll have a bit of a celebration next Monday. But if you want the ARC copy, just click the link below and you'll be notified. Actually, you'll be ask to send me an email and tell me about it. If you want an ARC copy, you need to contact me via email and then you can ask for the ARC copy. And you can also contact me through social media. So all that information is below as usual. If you guys didn't listen last week, I think that you should go back and listen to Ben Hawken. And before that, episode 239, I talked about backstory. So if you're looking for some tips on backstory, be sure to go back and listen to that episode as well. All right, here is the interview. Hello, Monica. Hey, how are you doing?
I am good. Very,
It
very
is.
good. How are you?
I'm good, except that it's very cloudy here. Is it always cloudy in Amsterdam? I have a vision of Amsterdam
Always.
being like always
Always.
like it's like England in my head, you know.
I mean, it basically is, yeah.
But you have bicycles, and I love biking around. I don't know why. Like, I think
And yeah, we do have bicycles. That's one of my favorite things of living here, honestly.
yes, yes, you can bike and pretty much not get run over. Whereas, like in the US, you can bike and take all risks upon yourself.
Yes, the bicyclists definitely run the show here for sure.
I love it. All right, so we've established that you live in Amsterdam. So we have
Yes.
something in common where we're kind of lovers of the Europe of all things Europe, right? Yes. So how did you get into writing? Would you tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about that?
Yeah. So it's funny, as a child, I really liked writing, but as a child, I just loved to play. I wasn't thinking about like publishing my book. Um, I wrote from a pretty young age, but I wasn't, I think I was writing Sabrina the Teenage Witch fan fiction.
Oh
I
yeah.
didn't know it was fan fiction when I was writing it. I was just having fun. Um, and I wrote my first book when I was 15, which will never see the light of day. And, you know, honestly, just loving writing. I loved acting as well, but I chose writing because I can be behind a desk and not have to memorize lines and go in front of people and all those things. It's much safer behind a desk.
That would definitely change things. You like the acting all by yourself as a kid, like acting out the story, but you're not for the stage.
I liked it, but I mean, this is kind of I was just talking to a client about this. I didn't want to be a part of an industry that was like all about your looks and all those kinds of things. And so I chose to go into the writing realm instead of the acting realm.
Yeah,
Because yeah, it's a very toxic industry in many ways. And so I love writing. It's kind of one of those things where I just love expressing. And I think writing is a really wonderful way to do that.
of course. And I mean, stories. It all
Yep.
comes down to story, right? Like we
Yep.
just love story, which is weird. It took me like 4 decades to figure out, like, oh, actually, I just really love stories. Like, I love
Yes.
movies, I love books, I love hearing people's stories. Like, if there's not a story attached to the conversation, I don't know why we're talking. Like,
Yeah.
I
Yep.
don't know why I'm here. I'm gonna go find a story. You know what, though? In Europe, don't you feel like being an actor is not as attached to looks as it is in America?
Yeah, it's not even close.
It's like ordinary people, and it feels
Yep.
great to
I
watch the
know. I
show.
was actually just talking with that client about it, and I was saying that, in Europe or the UK, it would be less attached because I mean, I guess content warning for eating disorders, but she had developed an eating disorder when she was working in the industry. And so I was talking about like how normalized that is in the US, and I don't know how it necessarily is in other countries, but I think it is a bit more just normal people
Yeah,
enacting here.
yeah. How
Yeah.
did we get there? I have no idea how
This
America
is
became
what
so
this is what
obsessed.
ADHDers do apparently.
Yeah. So we're gonna. So we're both. What is it that you write?
Yeah, so I write ugh, I write probably crossover, so between YA and new adult or adult.
Okay.
My most recent project is, I would say, probably closer to adult because there's some interesting things that happen. It's usually fantasy. I usually write fantasy, but I like all sorts of genres, all sorts of things, and so I might try something else at some point, but right now it's fantasy.
And you write under the same pen name, or do you?
Um, I don't know what pen name I'll write under when I publish yet. Yeah. my fiction is not published. I'm one of those writers that is I'm taking my sweet time. I think part of
Really?
that is because I was in the industry, worked in the industry. My graduate thesis is published, which is really ironic because I consider myself a recovering academic and I like wouldn't talk about my thesis with anyone. If they asked like where do I find your work, I would just be like, I don't have work out. Like don't look at my thesis.
Don't read this.
But that's published. But yeah, none of my fiction is. And so it's just one of those things where when I publish, I might use a pen name. I haven't decided. Do you use a pen name?
I don't. I wonder if I should have. Um, one of the things that kept me from publishing for a long time, even with Kindle, was that family would read it. And it
Yeah.
never occurred to me to make up a name. Like literally. It's so dumb. I don't know why. I think like it's partly because you want people to know, and then partly
Yeah.
you also don't. You want to
Right.
be like, celebrate me with me, but don't read it. You know?
Yeah. I think a lot of times they don't read it though. Like I
No, I
don't
think
think
they
that
don't.
my mom might read my book if it's an audiobook. And which is great. I mean, I'm glad that that's the thing. I don't think a lot of my other family would.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the other thing that you sort of have to come to realize in the writing world. Like, hey, published a short story or whatever. And they're like, cool.
Yeah. They
You
just
just,
don't get
yeah.
it.
I have to talk to clients all the time of like, it's okay. They won't read your book. Don't worry about it.
They
It's
won't
okay.
read your book. No.
Some people find it really hurtful, and mine is like the all-American, very divorced family. So I don't, I have no expectations on the family.
Yeah.
Not at all. Once again, we're going down rabbit trails, but that's okay. So what did you do your thesis in? Was it MFA? So you,
No, so I it's just very ironic thinking about it. So I got my bachelor's in English lit like any good writer. I'm this is a joke by the way. Don't have to get a bachelor's in English lit to be a writer. Um and then I went and got my master's in publishing. So I have a
oh,
publishing
that's a
degree.
thing.
It is a thing and I won't say more about it because I would go on a tangent if I do. And
What
yeah,
does
so I
that teach
studied.
you to learn what books are marketable? Like, I mean, like what does it teach you?
What does it do? So I learned about a lot of different processes in the publishing
Okay,
industry. We also, where I went to school, we also ran a press. So we ran a small press, which
that's
was really
fun.
nice. Yeah, because
Yeah,
we got to like have our toes in all different parts of the industry and
yeah.
because we were running our own thing. And yeah, so it was very hands-on, you know, kind of the type of thing that's like a business degree, but in
Okay,
what I wanted. I
great.
don't necessarily recommend. I won't go further into that topic, but
Well,
you
it's
know,
like anything, right? You kind of see the good and the bad on every part
yeah,
of
for
what
sure.
where you're going. So you didn't want to go literary agent though, or did you? Did you work in the agents?
I did work for two different agencies and I considered it. I considered being an agent, but I don't read quickly enough to be an
Oh,
agent. You have to
really?
read I mean, you have to read so fast. I mean, you have to be able to read manuscripts so quickly when you're getting fulls. I just didn't have the personality for it,
Yeah.
ultimately. I think I would have been really good at selling people's books. I'm a very good advocate for writers and authors, but I ultimately just, it wasn't in the cards. So,
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So once they choose like to go beyond just the query letter, they actually read the entire manuscript?
so I mean, the assistants will often read for them and tell them whether or not it's worth it to read. And then they'll go for, and then yeah, they're expected to read everything. And be able to, if you have an editorial agent, especially, they'll want to read everything and like give you really good notes and things like that. But it really depends on the agent.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, we could go down that area. I have lots of opinions on like how like subjective the entire
Yeah.
industry is.
It is very
Like,
subjective, very, very subjective. And I think that's something I am very grateful for learning
mm,
because seeing the quote unquote slush pile, I don't really like that term, but that's what people call it.
yeah.
Seeing all these really wonderful books coming through and seeing them be rejected, I just realized that rejection is like literally never personal.
Yeah.
And when you're on the other side and you have 100 queries to look at, the agent is looking for a reason to reject you. It's not because they don't want to be an advocate or help you or that your book sucks. It doesn't mean anything other than I have 100 queries and I have to choose which ones are
Right.
going to align with me and my vision for my career, your vision, all these different things. It's
Right.
never subject. It's sorry. It's never personal. It's always
Oh,
very subjective.
yeah. Yeah. And they have a boss to keep happy and a ladder they want to climb. So it's just, yeah, it's a rough industry. Did you hear about the latest way to get your arcs out? Did you hear about the Sally Rooney arc thing?
I think I saw a whisper of it, but I
Yeah,
don't know
they
anything
numbered
about
her
it.
arcs and it's which I don't know how I don't know why it would matter to number the arcs. Like if you sell it on eBay,
Scarcity.
I don't know. But anyway, unless they like microchipped it. That's what but I think it's the first time readers are realizing that quite possibly their bookstagram person is being paid by,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and I think that is the biggest thing. Like inside the industry, you go, well, of course. Like, how do you think they make money? And
Right,
I've had a couple of readers being like, oh my gosh. So they're like, no, okay, it's an arts industry. So, Spotify, that song that keeps coming up, like they're paying to get on the playlist.
right,
You have to play the game. It's just part of it. And yes, it sometimes feels unfair, but it's like, it's just the choices you make. You go indie, you go published.
right.
I don't know. And Sally Rooney has a proven track record of selling books. They probably
Right.
didn't do that the first time.
No.
So yes, it's all a bit of a game and it's all a bit rigged, but it's just is. It just is what it is. And I don't know that we're going to change it
I mean, I think it's like that in a lot of creative industries. It's not just publishing. Like
for sure.
my friend used to work in Hollywood and she would talk about similar things and it's just like that in a lot of industries. And I think in the day and age of the internet and people having more transparency into it, it will change. It just takes
Yeah,
time.
maybe. Yeah, yeah. But I think we also like to be part of a group. So you're like,
Yeah, we
well,
do.
I don't really care if she read it and whether she liked it or not, or is just getting paid for it. I read it, I liked it, and now I can find all the other people who
Yeah,
are reading it and liking it. And you find a group that way, right? So,
right.
so when did you decide to go out on your own and start your own business to help writers?
Yeah. So I was in the industry in New York and then COVID happened.
Oh,
I was working for a publisher there and then
bummer.
I won't go too much into what happened, but I didn't have a very good employment experience. I had a pretty abusive situation, which unfortunately happens with, all types of work situations. It's not just me in that. So COVID happened. COVID started in New York and um,
It was rough.
obviously it was pretty big there. So my husband and I decided to leave New York and we went back to Portland, where we had lived before. And at the time, I considered going back into the industry, whether that was as an assistant or whatever. I wasn't totally sure what I wanted, but I also knew deep down that publishing is really only in New York. There are some publishing houses that are outside of New York, but if
Okay.
I wanted to work in publishing, I probably needed to live in New York. And I was
Wow.
right. After COVID kind of quieted, a lot of publishers expected their people to be back in the office, and
Yeah.
remote work wasn't as accepted, and
Yeah.
people want a hybrid. Maybe I'll live in New York again someday. I have no idea, but that wasn't where I was in my journey at the time.
Yeah.
And then I got diagnosed with ADHD in 2021 and my
Oh, that recently.
that recently and
Okay.
my psychiatrist was like, a lot of ADHDers like to just have their own business. And I was like, okay, sure. And I just ran with it.
Yeah. Well, isn't that funny how it just takes one spark to be like, actually, yes. That's
Yep.
what I do.
One
Okay.
spark.
So how did you get diagnosed with ADHD? Because you're an adult, you're married,
Yep.
you're successful, you've written a thesis. I mean,
Right. Yeah, so I was one of those people that was watching all this information about it online, and I was like, oh my God. As a child, I wasn't dumb necessarily, but I was nowhere near a gifted kid. My brother he was valedictorian, very, very gifted academically. And then there was me who like was getting D's in classes and like didn't know how to do life you know, as a scholar in the K through 12 system. So eventually I figured out how to get through the system, but you know, when I started learning about ADHD, I was like, this seems really familiar. And so I reached out to, I believe it was the first place told me like, well, you have a master's. Like they basically just shut me down and thought like, because you have a master's, you can't have it, which
Mm,
obviously isn't true.
no.
Um, and then I reached out to another person. So I did go through, I can't remember exactly what the website was, but I think I used a website to find people, and then when I called someone, they would say, "Oh, I don't have any openings, but you could try this person," and they give me their number, right?
Right.
And that's how I ultimately got to who I worked with. He was very old school. I really liked him. And he's the one who diagnosed me, and he was like, "Yeah, like this." And when he asked me, like, has this been a struggle all your life?" I'm like, "Oh yeah." I was like, as a child, I was just really struggled, and I never understood why, and I always thought that I was broken.
Yeah.
And finally having answers to the reasons I struggled was just there's no way to explain how relieving it is to realize like, oh, I'm not broken. Like
Yes.
there's a reason
The
that I
system's
struggle.
broken.
The
There,
system's broken.
honestly, the
Yep.
system is broken. Because, I mean, it's interesting though that a professional place said that because you have a master's, you couldn't possibly have it. Like, I find it even, especially in America, we have so much innovation in America, and yet we're so stuck in some places of in that even still people think the stigmas of ADHD are
Yeah.
real.
Right.
Like it means that you're just in a corner like bouncing off the wall and
Right.
not getting anything done. Um, I think that's kind of disheartening, honestly, to see like a professional. Why did you want to get diagnosed? Like, what did that mean to you? Just that there was a path that you could pursue in sort of figuring things out?
Yeah. So as I was learning about everything, I realized like, oh, maybe there could be help or tools that I could use if
Okay.
I were to get this diagnosis, right? It was a way of me just going down a path to see like, is this an explanation for some of the struggles I've gone through?
Hmm.
And if I didn't get diagnosed, obviously I would be like, okay, what's another way of going forward? But it was like very clear
Yeah.
very quickly. Um, and I pretty much immediately started medication, and it worked super well, super quickly. My uncle was also diagnosed with ADHD, but he was much older. I think he was 50 when he was diagnosed, maybe 45, 50, somewhere in there. And I remember when he found out I was diagnosed and we had like a conversation on the phone, and we were just kind of connecting and lamenting about what it was like. Because he was also an adult when he got diagnosed. And
Yeah.
he was saying that it changed his life completely. It was like, and we both, I think, used the term, it was like a light went on in our brains when we were able
Yeah.
to get medication.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's man. It's I think I might be older than you, but especially for people that grew up in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, really, really, really depended on where you lived and what
Yeah.
your parents' worldview was and what the school's worldview was at the time and your access to medical care.
Yeah.
Like what was going to happen. And I think we also, I mean, I grew up in the middle of Wisconsin and spent all my days outside as a kid. And so
Yeah.
I think some of it just, you were just sort of like,
I'm a
you're just
kid.
being a kid.
Yep.
You weren't
Yeah.
as, there's some advantage to having run around so much until you're so exhausted
Yep.
that, maybe it's a little more obvious these days where there's more, you're spending more time with your parents, quite frankly, than
Yeah.
than we did as kids, where my mom would open the door and be like, don't come back till lunch. And that's what we did. We didn't want to be
Yep.
inside. We went out and played, So you're getting this diagnosis and you're at the same time kind of deciding to not go back to New York and start your own business. Is that kind of around this all happening at once?
Yep. Actually, yeah, when I think about it.
So,
Yeah, I started the business maybe 2 months after I was diagnosed, but I didn't like do a lot with it. I just started the LLC in the US and I was kind of just figuring out my path from there.
right.
But I did start it pretty quickly after the diagnosis and
And
it
did you know
just
you
kind of,
wanted to work with writers? Like, was
I
that
did.
okay?
I did. I, I just love the writing world. I love writing, I love books, and it felt like the next right step for me.
Mhm.
Time.
So what is it that you do with writers?
Yeah.
And
What do you do? So,
why were you teaching us to do this thing?
yeah. So I have a different kind of bent on what I do. I don't call myself a craft person.
Mhm.
I really work with people's like mental struggles, so like resistance. So I
Mhm.
often am called the resistance coach. So if someone struggles with procrastination, perfectionism, writer's block, all of the things that stop us from showing up, that's kind of where I have a niche
Yeah,
because I struggled massively with that,
right.
massively. I mean, I honestly still struggle with it. It's not easy for me to write. I do it and I show up, but it's not an easy thing for me to do.
Right.
And so I've walked that path, right? And I
Yeah.
can kind of help people start making, a habit again. I also teach the brain science around why we resist writing, and
Mm.
so that I can show that it's just your brain and it's not because you're broken.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my bent. I also have just a very, I don't know if you've read The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron,
Haven't read
but
that.
her kind of approach is very similar to mine. After I read that book, that's what really changed my life.
Mm.
And I have a very similar like approach to just focusing on process over
Mhm.
product.
Yeah.
Obviously, we all want to make money as writers and we want to publish our books and stuff like that. But when people have perfectionism struggles, craft and thinking about the product can actually be like really difficult and can make it so they just never write a word because they're
Yeah.
just so stuck.
I can see that. I think with craft you can find help anywhere.
Yep.
But it's not easy to find the community that is going to lift you up instead of being like, well, why didn't you just write?
Yep.
So
Yeah,
it's
it's
just
true. I
it,
mean,
go
every
ahead.
time I do my ads, the comments I get, yeah, the comments. People will just say the wildest things. Just be like, oh, like, well, if it's not easy for you to write, then just don't write. Like, you're not meant to be a writer. Or like, oh, well, you're not a perfectionist. You're just a hack. You shouldn't be trying to write if you can't do it. Like the weirdest, meanest things.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
that's often the messaging you'll see is people, spouting out this kind of stuff. And that's what writers who struggle with it see. And then they think there's something wrong with them.
Right. Oh my gosh, that's terrible.
I
I
screenshot them and I use them in my my training.
Yes, because it's true. It's what it makes you feel broken. Like you said, it reinforces that idea that, well, maybe I'm not a writer. If it's not easy for me to do, maybe I'm not a writer. The thing is, like, if you're trying to write fiction, it takes a lot of brain cells to figure out all of the things.
Right.
And then sometimes, especially when you have neurodiversity, you sit down and you go, what was I gonna, what? I had it here and now I don't know what I was gonna do. So people are so mean. I don't like it. I had
People on the internet, man.
there I just consider them all trolls at this point. I'm like, you're not real. Please don't be real.
I mean,
Um,
sometimes it's bots, it's not
yeah,
always
true.
actual people.
Yeah, the sad thing is sometimes it is a real person.
I
I mean,
know.
I've been part of a writing group where, especially men, I love you, men,
Yeah.
um, have grown up a certain way or have forced themselves, and kudos to them for themselves, but to do a certain thing. A, a friend of mine is taking this class because he's retired early and he has nothing better to do with his life. So
Fair.
he's taking a class and he's like, this is the guy that like ghost wrote a bunch of politicians' books. I don't know. I can't remember who they were. And he's like, so this is what I do. I wake up at 5:30, I get my coffee, I sit down, I work for 90 minutes. I get up, I take a half an hour walk, I sit down, I write for 90 minutes, and that's all you need to do for the day. And I said, yeah, that's great if you're a man and you have nothing else, no
Mm-hmm.
other responsibilities, and you're not a
Yep.
caretaker.
Yep.
And okay, it's great for
Uh-huh.
you. Don't put that out on everyone else. And like,
I
don't do
know.
that. Don't do that. Or Stephen King's On Writing. I had to talk a friend down and be like, you are a mother and a wife and you work part-time. No, you're
Yeah.
not going to be able to follow his method. It's impossible.
No. He was also like on drugs for a lot of, you know, it's like people just compare themselves a lot. And yeah, there's a lot of privilege in these systems, right? Like if you have, you know, the kind of life where someone's taking care of things, and yeah, you can totally sit down for 90 minutes in the morning and do what you can do. If you have
Right.
kids, that's not going to be the case. If you are caretaking for a parent, like if you go to a job, there's just so many things that get in our way. And I find those stories, I mean, I'm happy for people who have the space and the time, and I think that's great, but it's often not the common experience.
Yeah, it is not. And it's not the one that is spoken about. It's the one spoken about the most because it's the easiest to teach.
Yep.
So what you're teaching is like the hard thing to teach of like the mindset because you are not the person that fits into the box, right? Like
Right.
it's harder to define and get up for 30 minutes in a TED talk and say this is what you should do when you're working with your writers. It's like, well, actually you kind of need to I don't find your own system. Like what do you tell
Mm-hmm.
people? Like how do you
It's yeah, what you just said. I was just talking to a client today about trial and error, and I think it really is about finding your system and also being aware that your system will change over your life. Like you'll have a system and it will be working for a few months and then it'll need to shift, right?
Hmm.
And I think a lot of times, you know, people sell like a framework of like, this is the exact thing to do to like blah, blah, blah. And that's, you know, marketing works that way. That's what people respond to. But often that's not what actually helps people. It's very individual what helps people.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So as you built your business, what were some systems or some tools or some things that you changed or did that was kind of revolutionary to you in the way that you might have done it, like how you got your master's done and how you got academia done versus now that you're diagnosed, you
Mm,
sort of have a different path. What was different in this time?
yeah. I think a lot of it is just giving myself accommodations and knowing myself. So, for example,
Big one.
you know, when I teach, um, I don't try to be a professional. I just go there and I'm like, I'm gonna cuss. I'm gonna be myself. I'm not gonna be masking. Like maybe I'll have masking in the sense that I'm like putting on a show to teach and to show people something, right? And that's kind of different. But I'm not going to be sitting here like a corporate person
Mhm.
trying to explain it in this like professional tone where I'm wearing a blazer and a suit and I'm trying to look impressive. I just do not mesh with that. And the people who mesh with that kind of thing are not meant for me.
Mhm.
So that's one thing I do. I'm very careful about being myself so that I don't have to mask as much because it's very tiring to mask a lot.
Yeah.
Um, I think another thing is letting myself work when I actually want to be working. So I'm a night owl. I'd rather be working in the evening. I do not do 8 a.m. meetings or like early meetings. That's just not the vibe. And I also just don't have, you know, I don't have to have a 9 to 5 type of lifestyle, right? I can have my busy weekday, or sometimes I'm busy on the weekend with work, but that means like maybe on a weekday, on a Wednesday, I can go out and do whatever I want because I don't
Right.
have that type of system that I have to deal with. So basically, I've given myself just a lot of ways to make it work based on what I know works for my brain.
Mhm. but at the same time, you've been very successful in the last 3 years. So when you say doing what makes like I hear you on the giving grace, but you definitely work hard. Like I don't
I
want
work
anyone to think
very hard, yeah.
that you're like, oh, I just work whenever I want to. That's probably not true. It's not. I know that's not what you said, but sometimes that's what people hear. Of like, yeah,
Yeah,
she just works 2 hours a day.
I wish. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I think it's the way that my business is set up is that I'll have periods where it's so busy that I have no time for myself at all, and then I'll have quieter periods for a few weeks, right? I have the boot camp that I'm hosting in a couple of weeks, and right now I'm just about to get like so busy for probably 2 months, maybe 3 months. And then things quiet down for a month to 3 months, right? And then it picks back up. And I have that kind of seasonality to things. And that works fine. I think that's just how it is to have a business, honestly. It's just,
Yeah.
you'll have your launch season, you have your quiet seasons and things like that. But, I will admit, it's very easy to burn out just because like when you're a business, you're relying on yourself. And I tend to just work very hard for, because of the fact that like, I mean, partially because of the fact that my visa requires or relies on my business,
Mm,
but also because of the fact that, I mean, I do love what I do.
right.
And but there is probably a necessity of having a bit more balance. And I don't think that balance really exists. And so I'm having to figure out how to structure my life, knowing that that balance is probably never going to be really a thing.
Yeah, small business owner. I think that's a constant. It's almost just like you were saying before, it's a constant reevaluation even in the business owning world, right? Like
Yep.
as a writer you might find a system, but as a small business owner you might find a system and then have to readjust, and you might
Yep.
be called back to the States for whatever reason, or like family, whatever. Who knows? It always goes up and down, so life balance is, if you're happy doing what you're doing, you're already a little bit lucky, right? Like,
Yes. Agreed.
so do you think the first step for people, when they're getting diagnosed or they feel like maybe they should and they feel, I think I have said this twice, but I am on my podcast, I believe, but I really think that there are women hitting middle age and being like, I think there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And so I'm talking to a lot of them both in the writing community and out. So um, when they're getting to that stage, maybe they're diagnosed or they're not yet, do you think the number one step is that self grace, like that
Mm,
recognition of what it is? Or what do you think is the first biggest step that makes a change?
yeah. That's a really good question. When I was first learning about it, I think a step that I really needed was probably just, the self-compassion, the self-grace, like you just said, partially because of the fact that we're not really taught how to have self-compassion in our world, but also partially because if if you feel like, man, there's something wrong, you're probably right.
Mm,
You know yourself better than anyone else. And I think in a lot of cases, we gaslight ourselves into thinking like, well, my struggles aren't as bad as other people with ADHD or whatever it might be.
that's a good point.
I know that when I was diagnosed, I had friends who, quote unquote, had more severe symptoms. And I would think like, oh, like I don't have it as bad. But, we all have different struggles, right? Like my struggles might look different from theirs.
Mm,
And
true.
so self-compassion, also just like finding people who get it, having other ADHDers in your life. I will say my mom is probably also ADHD. She's never been diagnosed because she's fun fact, in middle age and can't get a diagnosis. Um, she, but she and I are very similar, and it's like so obvious that she's neurodiverse, and it often is hereditary, right? So if you have a family member, it can present as well for you. And so it's funny because I think seeing her, there was a little bit less brokenness in my own head because I was like, well, my mom is like that. So like it's not, I'm not broken. We're just like that. And so for a long time I just thought it's just who I am. It's like my genes, we're just like this.
Right, right,
Um,
right,
which was helpful realizing that like, oh, I saw my mom exhibit certain behaviors and I assumed that was just because I was like my mom. But
right,
actually it's yes, I'm like my mom, but for a reason.
right, right. We can, yes, we can also get some help on some of it. You're making me think of my grandmother right now.
Yeah. I
And the
mean, yeah.
literal walking in circles. And you go, oh no, grandma. Um, so what else would you suggest for people if they're like, I want to write? Or what do you tell people maybe? And we will definitely have information about your boot camp and we'll talk a little bit about that before we go. But for the writers who maybe are really struggling, maybe they come to you and they join your group and they're like, I have a story, but I just like, I can't seem to get it out. Maybe they've been writing it for a decade. What is it that you tell them? Are there any tools that
Mm,
you help them with? Because I'm sure there's a lot of mindset talking too, but are there things that people can look into? Maybe.
yeah. So a lot of so the main thing that I think brings people from the state of like sadness of I'm not writing to realizing like, oh, there's a step forward is when I talk about the
Mm,
brain science. And
mm,
I'll just give you a very, very small amount of it. Um, what I teach people is that your amygdala, so the house of your like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, is a dramatic little bitch. If you want me to repeat that without the cussing, I can. Do you want me to repeat that without the
okay.
cussing? Okay.
Yes, fine.
She's very dramatic and sees everything as a threat. Okay. So
Yeah.
like, going to the gym, I don't want that sounds hard. Our
Yeah.
bodies have been evolving to conserve energy so that we can
Right.
put out when we need to survive. So the amygdala is doing her dramatic thing. And the prefrontal cortex is where we're like, I want to write a book. And these two things don't there's a lot of push and pull between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And
Mm,
resistance often is where you're letting yourself listen to the amygdala too much and you're either in fight or flight or fawn, whatever that might look like, and
okay.
you're not showing up because of the lies that your amygdala is telling you.
Interesting.
So so for example, you sit down and you try to write and words like you get writer's block, words just go away.
Mm,
Sometimes that is basically a freeze response, and you have what I call what's called aphasia, which is loss of the language centers. And
okay.
that makes it so that it's hard to find words,
Right.
right? And what tends to happen is that people will show up for a day or two and it's really hard and they just walk away and think I'm not meant to be a writer. What
Right.
really needs to happen is that you have to build what I call writing neurons. So you
Mm,
show up for at least a month doing kind of a bare minimum.
hmm.
So, for example, when you go to the gym, you don't go to the gym and you say, I'm going to rep 50 pounds immediately. You build up to it, right? So you want to do the same thing with your writing. You want to
You don't
build
want
up,
to end up in the hospital. Like, please,
end up in
nobody
the
do
hospital. So you do that with your writing.
Ooh,
You show up for 5 minutes, and then after you
right.
feel a little more comfortable, 10 minutes, and then 15, and
Right.
then you can go from there and you build the habit. And then it'll get a bit easier.
Yeah. That seems so obvious, and yet I don't think we really think of it.
Nobody thinks of it that way.
Yeah.
No, every time I tell people that, they're like, "Oh, right, that seems so clear. Like it's neuroplasticity." But most people are never taught that.
Yeah. Because yeah, we just don't grow up like that. That's not how things are. You're supposed to sit down and you're just supposed to write it and you're just supposed to do
Right.
it. And my goodness, didn't you have to write like 500 book reports as a, I don't know that they do that anymore, but I had to.
Right.
And why can't you just do this and you have the
Right.
story and you're like all that rapid talking in your head and that you don't ever think, how would I just write for 5 minutes?
Yeah. I mean, it's people are like, "Oh, but why does my brain see it as a threat?" I'm like, "Your brain sees lots of things as a threat, babe. Like
So
going to
true.
the gym, your brain will tell you, "No, I want to be in front of the television eating chips." Like
Yeah,
your brain doesn't want to put out energy if it doesn't have to.
that's so true. That's a lot of like once you see that, I can see how that sort of frees you a bit. It
Yep.
opens you up to finding, oh, there's a different way to do this than to sit down for 90 minutes at 6 a.m. I'm not bitter about that man at all.
I mean, if that's what works for him, it's probably because he's built that habit
Right.
over time,
Right.
you
That's
know?
the other thing. We also listen to people who have like published
Yeah,
50 books. Yeah, I mean, if
right.
we understand, if he's telling the truth, it's like, well, then why are we listening to you? I'm trying to write my first one. Like, how are we doing?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's so true. We have to figure that out. So, what is it that you do in a boot camp? Like,
yeah.
what does that look like?
So the boot camp is, I go much deeper into the science part of it. So
Okay.
everything I just mentioned, I go into much more depth about it. I find that I personally love to know the why behind things, right? When I'm like, oh, right, your brain sees writing as a threat, and people are like, what? Like, why? Like, why is this so hard? And I go into all this information about the way the brain works. So the first day I always talk about like where resistance comes from, and that tends to be a little bit I guess you could call it, emotional for some people. We talk a lot about the education system, the systems that we live in as writers, and like how that can affect the way we show up and how it can make it so we don't show up, all these different things. Talk about your childhoods with like, did you have parents that supported you as a kid? If not, like, it's hard to write, right? There's a lot
Right.
of that. And then we talk about the science, and then I talk about how to start writing where you are now. So
Oh,
like we were talking about,
yeah.
a lot of people are caregivers or have jobs and like have all these things in life. And I meet people where they are in the sense that a lot of us don't have this perfect life where we have all the time in the world to write. So how can you start writing where you are now in your life and make time for it in a
Hmm.
very gentle way that will help you build those neurons?
Right, right. And stop listening to the rapid release people. I mean, that's one thing you do have to, that's hard as well. Like, that is something that your brain resists, I think, especially if you really have a desire to publish, because it's so easy to reach for those podcasts or the webinars or the social media where people are teaching a system that they have already figured out and they're so much further ahead and they're telling you that
Yeah,
if you just write a book in 60 days you can do, like,
right.
that's insane. So insane. Anyway,
Yeah,
but
I
it's a
think
lot.
it's a lot. And I think, people will sell what has worked for them. And like, that's great that it's worked for
Yeah.
them, but, that's not how writers work, right? Like, there are definitely some things that I teach. I'm like, okay, everybody wants to know the science of this. Everybody needs to know how to make it work for them.
Right.
But for so many people, it's individual. Like, I'll have people be like, oh, well, like, do I have to write an outline? Do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? And I'm like, it's no.
Yeah.
It's so individual. It's so personal. Writing is so, so
Mhm.
personal. And I feel like that's that's the difference between like the craft perspective, right? And more of like the creative process perspective.
Right.
I love craft, don't get me wrong. I've read tons of craft books and I often recommend them. But I also give people the caveat that these are guides and not rules, right? Like
Right.
it's a guide for you to figure out what would work in your life, but it's not like a rule box or a rule that says you have to do this.
Right, right, right. And I feel like if you can get through your resistance, you're going to be more able to apply whatever craft that
Yep,
you've decided to apply.
exactly.
That you're the path that you want to follow that way. So, where can people find out more information about this boot camp and all the other things that you're doing? You have a great newsletter too. Almost everyone who comes on here has a great newsletter, but you have a very good one. Like,
Thank
so
you. The Literary
the
Lantern.
literary lantern, I love the name of it too. It's like, oh, I'm shedding light on my writing journey here.
Yes, that's yeah. My assistant helped me come up with it. So yeah, you can find me at monicahay.com. All the links are on there. It'll show you the boot camp, it'll show you my Instagram, all the things that you want to see is all on that.
All right, there. That is a perfect link. We will have the link in the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Monica Hay, for coming on and being very honest with us about being a resistance coach and how we can maybe shed some light into our resistance and get help with it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.